The wind was a raw blade, scraping across the high plains, finding every gap in the cabin's rough-hewn logs. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sickness and desperation, clinging like a shroud to the meager warmth struggling from the hearth. Silas stepped over the threshold, the heavy door groaning shut behind him, sealing out the white fury of the blizzard but trapping him within a different kind of storm. He had come to end a life, a simple task in a world that dealt in brutal finality. His target, Eleanor Vance. The report had been precise, a woman alone, her presence deemed inconvenient. But the scene before him was not one of a lone woman awaiting fate. Eleanor Vance lay on a straw mattress near the fire, her face pale and drawn, her breath shallow and ragged. The sickness had clearly taken hold days ago, perhaps longer. She was already dying, the harsh winter and lack of sustenance doing what Silas had been sent to do, only slower, more cruelly. And surrounding her, huddled together like a clutch of cold-shocked birds, were children. 8 of them, ranging from perhaps 12 years old down to infants swaddled in threadbare blankets, their eyes wide and fearful as they stared at the tall, silent man who had just entered their fragile world. He stood just inside the door, snow melting from his oilskin duster and hat, forming small puddles on the dirt floor. His gaze, usually sharp and assessing, swept across the room, the empty shelves, the pitiful stack of damp firewood, the visible hunger etched on the children's faces, the faint, sickly smell that spoke of a fever that had burned unchecked. This wasn't the scenario he had been paid for. His mission was straightforward, clean. This was chaos, suffering laid bare, and the unintended consequences of his action would be absolute devastation for these innocents. The eldest girl, maybe 10, pulled a younger child closer, her eyes fixed on Silas with a mixture of terror and a nascent, fierce protectiveness. The smaller children whimpered softly. Eleanor stirred on the mattress, a weak cough racking her thin frame. Her eyes, clouded with fever, opened and found his. There was no fear in them, only a profound, weary sorrow and something else. A plea, perhaps, for the lives she would leave behind. She tried to lift a hand, but it fell back limply. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind outside and the children's quiet cries. Silas felt a flicker of something unfamiliar in his chest, not pity. His profession had long purged him of such weakness, but perhaps a form of grim acknowledgement. He was a man of death, yet this was a different kind of ending than the one he delivered. This was slow, agonizing decay, a natural brutality that mirrored, yet differed from, his own manufactured finality. He was a harbinger of swift closure. This was the slow, drawn-out defeat by the elements and illness. He stood there for a long moment, the weight of the unexpected tableau pressing down. The commission felt irrelevant now. To kill her would be redundant. To leave would be to condemn the children to certain, rapid death once the last ember died. Neither option aligned with the cold calculus that usually governed his actions. He was built for purpose, not for the passive observation of a tragedy already in motion. His fingers, accustomed to the cold steel of his tools, flexed inside his gloves. The air grew colder as the last heat seeped from his clothing. He had to make a decision, but the sheer helplessness of the scene, the raw vulnerability of the children clinging to their dying mother, held him in place. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the despair in the small cabin. This was not the kill he had planned. This was survival stripped bare. He remained standing for a long while, the children watching him with guarded, uncertain eyes. Eleanor's breathing grew quieter, the struggle less visible. She drifted in and out of consciousness. The cabin felt impossibly cold. Silas shed his duster, the thick canvas heavy in his hands. He laid it over Eleanor, a simple, almost involuntary act. Her eyes fluttered open again, and for a brief moment, the fever seemed to recede, leaving a flicker of clear comprehension. A question seemed to hang in her gaze, but she was too weak to voice it. He offered no explanation, no words at all. Words were not his tools. He turned instead to the hearth, examining the paltry collection of logs. They were damp, spitting more smoke than flame. He found a small, rusty shovel leaning against the wall and went back outside, into the teeth of the storm. The children flinched as the door opened and closed, letting in a blast of icy air and a swirl of snow. They huddled closer together, watching the door, then looking back at their mother. Silas returned a short time later, dusted with snow. His arms laden with dry branches he'd found clinging to the stunted pines further from the cabin. He broke them expertly, adding them to the fire. The flames caught, hesitantly at first, then grew stronger, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The children watched, their fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. He found a dented pot, scooped snow into it, and set it near the fire to melt. He worked methodically, silently, his movements efficient and deliberate. There was no warmth in his demeanor, but there was a stark, undeniable competence. He checked the larder empty save for a small amount of dried beans and a lump of rancid fat. Not enough to sustain 8 children and a sick woman for long. He glanced at Eleanor, then at the children. He hadn't come to save them. Yet, he found himself engaged in the brutal, immediate struggle for their survival. The original purpose of his journey seemed to recede, replaced by the urgent, silent demands of the present. He found a battered tin cup, filled it with the melted snow water, and knelt by Eleanor. He gently lifted her head, holding the cup to her lips. She drank weakly, a few sips, before turning her head away, exhausted. The eldest girl, watching, seemed to relax fractionally. The smallest infant began to cry, a thin, reedy sound of hunger. Silas looked at the child, then at the meager supplies. He had resources, but they were on his horse, some distance away through the worsening blizzard. Getting to them was a risk, but staying here without them was a guarantee of failure. He rose and went to the door again. The wind shrieked its protest. He pulled on his duster, hesitated for a moment, his hand on the latch, then opened the door and stepped back out into the maelstrom. The children's eyes followed him until the door closed. The hour Silas was gone stretched into an eternity inside the cabin. The fire crackled bravely, fed by the dry branches, offering a circle of warmth against the biting cold that pressed in from all sides. Eleanor's breathing remained shallow, but the water seemed to have helped, her skin appearing marginally less ashen. The children huddled closer to the fire, occasionally casting nervous glances at the door. The eldest girl, whose name was Sarah, tried to comfort the younger ones, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. The infants' cries had subsided into whimpers of exhaustion. The hunger in the room was a palpable entity, a gnawing presence that overshadowed even the fear of the man who had arrived. When the door finally opened again, a fresh gust of snow accompanying his entrance, Silas looked like a ghost carved from ice. His duster was coated, his hat rimmed with white, but in his arms he carried sacks. He dropped them with a soft thud onto the floor. One contained firewood, split and dry. The other held provisions: flour, salt pork, dried apples, beans, coffee, and a small bag of sugar. He had risked the storm, risked his life to bring them supplies. There was no explanation offered, no gesture of kindness in his movements. He simply set the sacks down and began the work of survival. He didn't speak. He replenished the fire, filling the small space with welcome heat. He melted more snow, then started a pot of beans, adding chunks of salt pork. The aroma, thin at first, gradually filled the cabin, a scent of hope in the despairing air. The children watched him, their fear slowly transforming into a quiet, hungry anticipation. He moved with a quiet strength, his presence filling the cabin, pushing back against the encroaching cold and silence. He was not gentle, but his actions were not rough either. They were simply necessary. Eleanor stirred again, her eyes flickering open as the smell of cooking food reached her. She saw him by the fire, silhouetted against the flames, a figure of imposing stillness and purpose. She looked at the sacks on the floor, at the children watching him, their faces alight with a fragile hope. The plea in her eyes from before seemed to shift, becoming something new: confusion, perhaps, and a flicker of disbelief. Why was he here? Why was he doing this? The questions hung unspoken in the air between them. She was the target, the problem to be eliminated. Yet he was keeping them alive. He finished cooking the beans, scooping them into tin bowls he'd found stacked near the meager wash basin. He served the children first, handing each bowl silently. Sarah took hers with a shaky hand, murmuring a barely audible thank you. He didn't acknowledge it. He knelt by Eleanor, offering her a small bowl. She managed a few spoonfuls, the simple sustenance a shock to her weakened system, but also a source of strength she hadn't felt in days. He then served himself, eating quickly, his gaze scanning the room, ever watchful. As the children ate, the tension in the cabin eased slightly. The immediate threat of starvation was momentarily pushed back. The man, the silent, capable stranger, was not an enemy. He was, for now, their lifeline. Eleanor watched him from the mattress. His face was hard, his eyes sharp, but there was a steady presence about him that she, in her vulnerability, found herself clinging to. She didn't know his name, where he came from, or why he was here. But he had brought warmth and food, and that, in this desolate place, was everything. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but inside the small cabin, a fragile truce had been called between despair and a grim, unexpected survival. The children, their bellies partially filled, began to relax, some drifting off to sleep near the fire. Eleanor felt a flicker of strength, a desperate refusal to let the sickness claim her when these lives depended on her. The man watched the fire, his thoughts inscrutable, the purpose that had brought him here lost in the flickering light. Days bled into a week. Eleanor's fever broke, slowly, leaving her weak but conscious. The constant coughing subsided, replaced by the slow, arduous process of regaining strength. Silas remained. He fixed the roof, patched cracks in the walls, ensuring the cabin held against the brutal winter. He hunted small game, supplementing the meager stores, teaching Sarah how to prepare them. He was a man of few words, his instructions curt and to the point, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a silent, unyielding guardian, a bulwark against the harsh world outside and the lingering weakness within. Eleanor watched him. She saw the way he handled the children, not with tenderness, but with a quiet patience. He showed the younger ones how to stack wood, how to fetch water from the frozen creek by breaking the ice. He listened, seemingly without effort, to their chatter, occasionally responding with a single word or a nod. He read stories from a worn Bible Sarah found, his voice a low rumble that filled the evenings. He was a man of stark contradictions, capable of violence, clearly, with the hard set of his jaw and the watchful intensity in his eyes. Yet here, he was the quiet architect of their survival. The original reason for his presence remained a dark, unspoken question between them. She knew instinctively that he had come to harm her. Yet he had saved her and, more importantly, saved the children. The knowledge sat heavy, a strange, dangerous secret shared in the quiet confines of the cabin. One afternoon, a rider approached through the snow, a lone figure silhouetted against the white landscape. Tension immediately seized the cabin. Silas moved towards the door, his body language shifting, becoming coiled and ready. He checked the rifle he kept near the entrance. Eleanor watched him, her heart pounding. Was this connected to him? To her? The rider dismounted some distance away, approaching on foot. He was a large man, bundled against the cold, his face obscured by a scarf and hat. Silas stepped outside, closing the door behind him, leaving Eleanor and the children in agonizing suspense. Through the small, grimy window, Eleanor could see the two men talking. Their bodies were tense, their gestures sharp. The other man seemed agitated, pointing towards the cabin. Silas stood his ground, unmoving, like a rock in a turbulent stream. He spoke little, his responses clipped. The conversation grew more heated. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but the confrontation was clear. Was this the threat, the inevitable consequence of whatever past had brought Silas here? Was this the moment everything unraveled? She looked at the children, their faces mirroring her fear. Sarah was holding a younger child tightly, her eyes wide. Suddenly, the other man lunged forward. Silas moved with blinding speed. There was a brief, brutal struggle, silent from this distance except for the crunch of boots on snow. Silas disarmed the man with a swift, efficient motion and threw him forcefully to the ground. He stood over him for a moment, then kicked something away into the snow, the man's weapon. He said something Eleanor couldn't decipher, his voice low and cutting even from afar. The other man scrambled to his feet, looking shaken and defeated. He hesitated, then turned and walked back towards his horse, mounted and rode away, disappearing back into the swirling snow. Silas watched him go, a figure of grim stillness, before turning back towards the cabin. Eleanor released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The crisis had passed, handled with a ruthless efficiency that reminded her exactly what Silas was, or had been. Yet he had not brought the violence inside. He had kept it at bay. He opened the door and stepped back into the warmth, the tension radiating off him slowly dissipating. He met Eleanor's gaze across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The world outside was dangerous, but for now they were safe. After the stranger left, a quiet understanding settled in the cabin. Eleanor knew, without being told, that Silas had dealt with something connected to his past, or perhaps hers or both. He offered no explanation and she asked for none. Words were unnecessary. His actions had been the answer. He had chosen to defend them, not abandon or harm them. This act, more than any provision he'd brought or repair he'd made, solidified his place among them. Not as a rescuer, not as a captor, but as something entirely unexpected. A silent, formidable partner in their survival. Eleanor regained her strength day by day. She took back the care of the children, her presence a comfort and reassurance to them. But the dynamic had shifted. Silas was no longer just a temporary provider. He was part of the household. He continued his quiet work, maintaining the cabin, hunting, ensuring their safety. Eleanor, watching him, saw not a cold-blooded killer, but a man shaped by hardship, perhaps driven by a code she didn't understand, yet capable of choosing preservation over destruction when faced with unexpected vulnerability. She began to talk to him, small things at first, about the children, the harshness of the winter, the small victories of their day. His responses were sparse, sometimes just a grunt or a nod. But he listened. He was present. One evening, as the children slept, Eleanor sat by the fire, mending a torn blanket. Silas was sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound save for the fire. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. It was the first time she had directly addressed the unspoken question. He paused his work, his gaze steady. He didn't immediately answer. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history and the weight of their improbable situation. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, and used to lengthy explanation. Orders changed, that was all. Not an apology, not a confession, but a simple, almost dismissive statement of altered purpose. It was enough. Orders changed. Circumstance changed him. The sight of her dying, surrounded by helpless children, had changed the nature of his task. He had been sent to extinguish a life, but the scene had demanded something else entirely, the preservation of lives already flickering precariously. He hadn't become a saint or a protector out of sudden, tender feeling. He had simply adapted, his formidable skills redirected from destruction to sustainment out of some internal logic known only to him. Eleanor nodded slowly, accepting his answer, because it was the only one she would get, and because his actions had already proven its truth. He hadn't left. He hadn't harmed them. He stayed, a silent, capable presence in their lives, a quiet force pushing back against the relentless world. The resilience that had kept Eleanor alive through loss and sickness now found a new strength, not in solitary endurance, but in a shared, unspoken bond with this unlikely guardian. The winter eventually broke. The snow melted, the creek thawed, and the first hesitant signs of spring appeared on the plains. Life in the cabin remained hard, but it was no longer a desperate struggle for immediate survival. They had weathered the storm, both external and internal. Silas didn't leave with the melting snow. He remained, a silent shadow at the edge of their lives, yet firmly anchored within them. The children no longer feared him. They simply accepted him, another immutable part of their world. Eleanor had faced death and the threat he represented, and emerged stronger, her vulnerability replaced by a quiet dignity and the fierce determination to protect her young family, a task she now shared with a man sent to destroy her. The world outside remained harsh and unpredictable, but within the small cabin, built on a foundation of necessity and tempered by shared hardship, an improbable form of hope had taken root. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was life, resilient and enduring, a testament to the unexpected turns of fate and the quiet, transformative power of need.